The gold nib of the Mont Blanc pen scratched against the heavy legal parchment, sealing a decade-long marriage into oblivion. Vian handed the pen back to his attorney with a barely concealed, triumphant smirk. He was walking away with the multi-million-dollar tech startup, the architectural masterpiece in the Hamptons, and a devastatingly young new fiancée waiting for him in the lobby. He had left his famously thrifty wife with a modest, fixed settlement, completely certain he had just executed the financial heist of the century. What Vian didn't know, as Odetta quietly signed her own name on the dotted line, was that the startup he prized, the bank holding his assets, and the very skyscraper they were sitting in, belonged entirely to her. Vian Jasson was a man who believed his own press. At 42, he was the charismatic CEO of Aegis Logistics, a Boston-based supply chain tech firm that had recently secured a staggering Series C funding round. He wore custom Brioni suits, drove a matte black Porsche 911, and had cultivated the exact kind of aggressive, hyper-optimized lifestyle that graced the covers of business magazines. He was a self-made man, or so he told anyone who would listen at the exclusive cocktail parties overlooking the Charles River. His wife, Odetta, was the stark opposite. To Vian, and to the glittering social circles he desperately courted, Odetta was painfully ordinary. She was 39, wore unbranded beige sweaters, drove a 6-year-old Volvo station wagon, and spent her weekends volunteering at the botanical gardens or reading thick historical biographies. She didn't wear makeup. Her jewelry consisted of a simple gold wedding band, and she had a habit of remaining entirely silent during Vian's boisterous dinner parties. Vian had met Odetta in college, back when he was a struggling engineering student, and she was an art history major who always seemed to have an extra $20 to spot him for pizza. Over the years, as his ambition skyrocketed, he began to view Odetta not as a partner, but as a relic of his humble beginnings. She was an anchor weighing down his ascent. The breaking point, in Vian's mind, arrived in the form of Minna Jenkins. Minna was 27, the newly appointed Vice President of Public Relations at Aegis. She was vibrant, ruthless, wore designer stilettos that clicked sharply on the hardwood floors, and looked at Vian with a mixture of awe and predatory hunger. Minna understood his vision. Minna belonged in the penthouse he was secretly eyeing in Back Bay. Odetta, on the other hand, belonged in a suburban garden. The betrayal wasn't even a slow burn. It was a swift, calculated decision. Vian had long since decoupled his finances from Odetta's, maintaining their joint account for household expenses, while funneling the bulk of his burgeoning wealth into a labyrinth of private trusts and offshore holdings in the Cayman Islands. He was a master of the corporate shell game, hiding his true net worth to protect his empire. On a freezing Tuesday in November, Vian walked into the modest, slightly dated kitchen of their Brookline home. Odetta was at the island, quietly sipping tea and reading the morning paper. "We need to talk," Vian said, not bothering to take off his cashmere overcoat. "I'm filing for divorce." Odetta didn't flinch. She slowly set her teacup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes entirely unreadable. "I see," she said. Her voice was infuriatingly calm. "Is there a specific reason?" "We've outgrown each other, Odetta. Or rather, I've grown, and you've stayed exactly the same. You're happy with a mediocre, quiet life. I'm building a legacy. It's not fair to either of us to pretend this is working." He paused, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the throwing of plates. He was armed with psychological defenses, ready to play the victim of a stagnant marriage. Odetta simply nodded. "Who is she?" Vian stiffened. "This isn't about another woman. It's about our fundamental incompatibility." "It's Minna Jenkins, isn't it?" Odetta asked, picking up her tea again. "I noticed the charge for the Van Cleef necklace on your secondary platinum card, the one you think I don't have the login for." Vian's jaw tightened. "Fine. Yes. But that's a symptom, not the disease. I've already spoken to Gregory Finch. He's drawing up the papers. I'm willing to be generous, Odetta. I'm not going to leave you on the street. But I built Aegis. That company is mine. You've never worked a corporate day in your life, and I won't let you dismantle my life's work." "Generous," Odetta repeated the word as if tasting a bitter almond. "What does generous look like to you, Vian? You can keep this house. It's paid off. I'll give you a lump sum of $2 million to ensure you're comfortable, and you keep whatever is in your personal checking accounts. In exchange, you sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and waive all rights to Aegis Logistics, my future earnings, and the Hamptons property." To a layman, $2 million sounded like a fortune, but Vian knew Aegis was currently valued at roughly $300 million. His personal stake was worth north of $180 million. He was offering her pennies on the dollar, banking heavily on her complete ignorance of corporate valuation and her inherent aversion to conflict. Odetta looked around the quiet kitchen, then back at Vian. $2 million, and I keep my personal accounts." "It's more than fair," Vian pushed, stepping closer, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate her. "If you fight me, Odetta, I will drag this out in court for years. I have Finch. You don't have a lawyer. The legal fees will eat up whatever you think you're entitled to. Take the deal. Walk away quietly." Odetta stared at him for a long, heavy moment. A strange, fleeting shadow crossed her face, something that, had Vian been paying closer attention, looked dangerously like amusement. "All right, Vian," she said softly. "Have Mr. Finch send the paperwork to my attorney." Vian scoffed. "Your attorney? Who? The guy who did our wills 10 years ago?" "Samuel Whitman," Odetta said, returning her gaze to the newspaper. "He'll be expecting the call." As Vian turned and walked out the door, already dialing Minna to celebrate his easy victory, he felt a surge of adrenaline. It was done. He had won. He had no idea he had just stepped onto a landmine. The mediation process was an exercise in theatrical cruelty, orchestrated by Vian's lawyer, Gregory Finch. Finch was a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney, a man who viewed litigation as a blood sport. He wore pinstripes, possessed a booming baritone voice, and specialized in intimidating opposing counsel into submission. They met in Finch's expansive corner office overlooking the Boston Harbor. Vian sat at the long mahogany table, radiating confidence, checking his Rolex Submariner every few minutes to signal how valuable his time was. Across from them sat Odetta and her attorney, Samuel Whitman. Whitman looked exactly as Vian had expected. An elderly, rumpled man in a slightly ill-fitting tweed suit with a briefcase that looked like it had survived the Eisenhower administration. He peered at the documents through thick bifocals, occasionally adjusting his hearing aid. Vian almost felt embarrassed for them. It was like watching a lion prepare to devour a wounded gazelle. "Let's cut to the chase, Mr. Whitman," Finch boomed, tossing a thick stack of financial disclosures across the table. "My client is offering a very clean, very equitable split. The Brookline property, a $2 million cash settlement, and a clean break. We've reviewed Mrs. Jasson's financials. She has no significant assets, no income to speak of, and a modest savings account at Wellington Private Bank with roughly $40,000 in it. My client is essentially securing her future." Whitman adjusted his glasses, slowly turning the pages. "And the valuation of Aegis Logistics? Premarital and strictly the result of my client's sole intellectual property and labor," Finch fired back. "Mrs. Jasson has never set foot in the Aegis offices. she has made zero contributions to its success. Odetta sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect. She was wearing a simple navy blue wool coat and no jewelry. She looked small in the massive leather chair. "I did host the initial investor dinners in our home," Odetta said quietly. "For the first 3 years." Vian laughed out loud. "You made lasagna, Odetta. Making lasagna does not entitle you to $100 million in equity." Whitman held up a trembling hand. Now, Mr. Jason, let us remain civil. My client is not looking for a protracted battle. She is a private woman. She merely wishes for security." Whitman looked at Odetta, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. However, Whitman continued, his voice wavering slightly. "My client does have one specific request regarding the settlement structure." Finch narrowed his eyes. "Which is?" "She wishes to retain complete, unquestioned ownership of her personal accounts at Wellington Private Bank, and she asks that Mr. Jason waive his right to any future discovery regarding those accounts. In exchange, she will sign the waiver releasing her claim to Aegis Logistics." Vian suppressed a grin. He had secretly hacked into Odetta's laptop weeks ago to check that Wellington account. He had seen the balance with his own eyes, $42,510. She was so terrified of losing her little rainy day fund that she was willing to trade away her legal right to fight for half of a $300 million tech empire. It was pathetic, really. "Done," Vian said instantly, ignoring the warning glance from Finch. Finch cleared his throat. "Mr. Jason, it is generally my advice to—" "I said done, Gregory," Vian snapped. "If letting her keep her grocery savings gets her signature on that waiver today, I'll sign it." Whitman coughed politely. "Very well. We will need a legally binding addendum stating that Mr. Jason formally relinquishes any and all rights, claims, and future interests in any accounts, trusts, holding companies, or assets associated with Odetta Jason at Wellington Private Bank or its parent institutions in perpetuity." "Write it up," Vian said, leaning back and crossing his arms. He looked at Odetta, shaking his head. "You always were short-sighted, Odetta. But fine, you keep your little bank account. I keep my company." "Thank you, Vian," Odetta said softly. "That is all I ask." Over the next 3 weeks, the paperwork was drafted. Minna had officially moved her things into Vian's temporary luxury rental, already picking out imported Italian marble for the penthouse they were closing on next month. Vian's life was moving at warp speed. Aegis had just secured a massive logistics contract with an international shipping conglomerate, pushing the company's valuation closer to $500 million. He felt invincible. He didn't notice that Odetta hadn't contested a single detail of his offshore accounts. He didn't notice that she hadn't asked for alimony. He didn't realize that Samuel Whitman, the doddering old lawyer in the tweed suit, was actually the senior managing partner of Whitman, Carmichael and Cross, the most ruthless, high-end trust and estate law firm in the country, operating strictly on retainer for legacy wealth families. And most crucially, Vian did not know what Wellington Private Bank actually was. He thought it was a boutique local branch for wealthy New Englanders. He didn't know that Wellington was a subsidiary of the Harrington-Kensington Trust. Odetta wasn't just Odetta Hayes, the quiet girl from college. She was Odetta Kensington, the sole surviving heir to the Kensington family, a bloodline that had built railroads, owned massive swaths of Manhattan real estate, and quietly controlled a global private equity empire worth upwards of $40 billion. Odetta had hidden her identity for 20 years. She had watched her parents' lives be destroyed by the paranoia and vultures that extreme wealth attracted. When she went to college, she used her mother's maiden name, Hayes, and vowed to live a normal life. She wanted to be loved for herself, not for her trust fund. When she met Vian, his ambition had been charming. But as the years passed, she watched the money, a fraction of what she actually possessed, turn him into a monster. She had given him enough rope to hang himself, and Vian had greedily tied the noose. The final signing took place on a Thursday morning, high up in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in the financial district. The sky outside was a brilliant, cold blue, matching Vian's mood. He arrived early, flanked by Gregory Finch and a junior associate carrying boxes of indexed files. Vian was dressed for a victory lap, a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that subtly matched the Aegis corporate colours. Minna was downstairs, sipping a matcha latte in the lobby, waiting to whisk him away to a celebratory weekend in St. Bart's. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors opened. Odetta walked in, followed closely by Samuel Whitman. Odetta looked different today. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but Vian felt a strange prickle at the back of his neck. She wasn't wearing her usual shapeless beige cardigan. She wore a tailored black crepe blazer over a silk blouse, the cut so precise it looked sculpted. Her posture, usually slightly bowed to accommodate Vian's dominating presence, was entirely straight. She didn't look like a defeated housewife. She looked like an executive walking into a hostile takeover. "Morning, Odetta," Vian said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Ready to get this over with?" "Good morning, Vian," she replied smoothly, taking her seat. She didn't look at the massive stacks of paper in front of her. She looked directly into his eyes. Her gaze was chillingly steady. Finch took control, distributing the thick-bound documents. "We have the final decrees, the asset division agreements, the non-disclosure forms, and the specific addendum requested by Mr. Whitman regarding the Wellington private bank accounts." Whitman, who seemed to have entirely lost his doddering demeanour, pulled a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket and handed it to Odetta. "Everything is in order, Odetta." "Let's review the waiver one last time," Finch insisted, pointing a thick finger at the page. "Mr. Jasson is paying an immediate sum of $2 million. Mrs. Jasson waives all rights to Aegis Logistics. Mr. Jasson waives all rights to any assets held by Mrs. Jasson at Wellington." "We understand the terms, Mr. Finch," Whitman said, his voice suddenly sharp and crisp, completely devoid of the old man waiver he had utilized in mediation. "Let us proceed." Vian didn't hesitate. He practically snatched the pen from his associate and signed his name with aggressive flourishes across the marked pages. He felt a profound sense of relief washing over him. The chains were off. He was keeping his empire. He slid the documents across the polished table to Odetta. Odetta looked down at the papers. She traced the edge of the signature line with her index finger. For a brief second, she remembered the boy she had met in the campus library, the one who had been so worried about paying off his student loans. That boy was dead, buried under layers of greed and arrogance. With fluid, practiced motions, Odetta Kensington signed her name. Finch gathered the documents, stamped them, and handed a certified copy to each attorney. "It is done. The divorce will be finalized by the judge on Monday, but these agreements are binding as of this exact moment." Vian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He let out a loud exhale. "Well, Odetta, I wish you the best. Truly. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for in your garden." Odetta remained seated. She closed her folder and looked up at him. "Please sit down, Vian. We aren't finished." Vian frowned, pausing half-turned toward the door. "Excuse me?" "Yes, we are. The ink is dry. You have your settlement. I have a flight to catch." "Sit down," Odetta repeated. It wasn't a request. It was a command, spoken with a quiet, terrifying authority that Vian had never heard from her in 10 years of marriage. Finch bristled. Mrs. Jasson, the proceedings are concluded. My client has no obligation to— Mr. Finch, Samuel Whitman interrupted, his tone laced with ice. I strongly suggest you advise your client to sit down. This is a matter of severe financial urgency regarding Aegis Logistics. The mention of his company stopped Vian cold. He slowly lowered himself back into the leather chair, a cold knot forming in his stomach. What are you talking about? You just signed away your rights to Aegis. I did, Odetta agreed softly. I have no claim to your shares, but I think it's time you understood who you've been doing business with. She gestured slightly to Whitman, who opened his slim, vintage briefcase and withdrew a single, crisp folder. He slid it across the table, not to Vian, but to Finch. Finch opened the folder. His eyes darted across the single sheet of paper inside. The color instantly drained from the lawyer's face. He looked at the paper, then at Odetta, then back to the paper, as if his brain could not process the text. "What is it, Greg?" Vian demanded, leaning over to look. "Mr. Jasson," Whitman said smoothly, folding his hands on the table. 2 weeks ago, Aegis Logistics closed its Series C funding round, securing $150 million to fund your international expansion. The lead investor, acquiring 30% of the newly issued preferred stock and holding majority voting rights on the board, was a private equity firm named K Holdings. "I know who my investors are," Vian snapped, though his heart was beginning to hammer against his ribs. K Holdings is a subsidiary of a massive European trust. "Not European," Odetta corrected him gently. "American." She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, the facade of the meek, thrifty wife melting away completely to reveal the terrifyingly calm predator beneath. K Holdings is a shell corporation, Vian. It stands for Kensington Holdings. It is managed by Wellington Private Bank. She smiled, a cold, surgical expression. "The bank account you so graciously allowed me to keep, and permanently waived all your rights to." Vian stared at her, the words buzzing in his ears like static. "Kensington. What are you saying? You have $40,000 in that account." "I have $40,000 in checking," Odetta said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Wellington Private Bank manages my family's trust, the trust I am the sole beneficiary of, the trust that currently holds roughly $42 billion in assets." Vian couldn't breathe. The walls of the glass conference room suddenly felt like they were closing in. That's impossible. You're Odetta Hayes. Your parents were school teachers." "My mother was a teacher, yes, because she wanted to be. My father was Arthur Kensington." Finch, pale and sweating, finally found his voice. "Vian, she owns the debt. K Holdings didn't just buy equity. They bought up the mezzanine debt from your Series B round. The covenant states that in the event of a change in executive control or a breach of character clause—" Finch swallowed hard. "They hold the right to call in the loan immediately, or seize your remaining 60% equity as collateral." "You built a wonderful company, Vian," Odetta said, her eyes devoid of pity. "But you leveraged it to the hilt to fund your lifestyle and your offshore accounts. You need K Holdings capital to keep the lights on next quarter." You signed the waiver," Vian shouted, slamming his hand on the table, his composure shattering. "You waived your right to Aegis." "I waived my right to your personal shares as your wife," Odetta said smoothly. "I did not waive my rights as the majority shareholder and primary debt holder of the corporation through K Holdings. The divorce is final. We are no longer married." She stood up, buttoning her blazer. "As of 10:05 a.m., I am just your biggest investor, and I am calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." "You can't do this!" Vian yelled, the reality of his total ruin crashing over him. "I'll sue you. I'll tell the board." "Tell them what, Mr. Jasson?" Whitman asked dryly. "That you were outmaneuvered by a woman you deemed too unintelligent to understand business? You signed the agreement. You waived discovery on Wellington. It is ironclad. We made certain of it." Odetta looked down at Vian, who was now gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I didn't take your company from you, Vian," Odetta said softly, delivering the final, fatal blow. "You gave it to me, just like you gave away our marriage. Enjoy your $2 million. In Boston, that might buy you a nice condo, but I'd advise against the Back Bay penthouse." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing like a countdown in the silent room. The Aegis Logistics headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a gleaming glass skyscraper in the Seaport district. Normally, Vian walked into the executive suite like a conquering emperor, fueled by a double-shot espresso and his own boundless ego. On Friday morning, however, he arrived looking like a man who had survived a shipwreck. His bespoke Brioni suit was visibly wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night, spent screaming at a terrified Gregory Finch over the phone, and his hands possessed a fine, uncontrollable tremor. Minna Jenkins, looking effortlessly chic in a cream-colored Stella McCartney sheath dress, met him by the frosted glass doors of the boardroom. She held a tablet against her chest, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Vian, what is happening?" Minna whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "The board members have been arriving for the past 20 minutes. There are 3 partners from Kirkland and Ellis in there, and the representatives from K Holdings won't speak to anyone. My PR team is completely locked out of the communications loop. Is there a hostile bid?" Vian grabbed her arm, perhaps a little too tightly, pulling her into the alcove near the restrooms. "Listen to me, Minna. Whatever happens in there today, keep your mouth shut. Do not defend me. Do not speak unless spoken to." Minna pulled her arm away, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp wariness. She had hitched her wagon to a rising star, not a sinking ship. "Viana, you're scaring me. Who called this meeting?" "The majority shareholder," Vian spat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Before he could explain further, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. Samuel Whitman, Odetta's supposedly doddering estate lawyer, stood in the doorway. Today there was no tweed. Whitman wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit, looking every bit the apex legal predator he truly was. "Mr. Jasson," Whitman said, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed reception area. "We are waiting." Vian swallowed hard, adjusted his tie with shaking fingers, and walked into his own slaughter. The Aegis boardroom was a masterpiece of modern corporate design, featuring a 30-foot table made from a single slab of reclaimed walnut, surrounded by ergonomic Herman Miller chairs. At the head of the table, in the seat permanently reserved for Vian, sat Odetta. She wasn't wearing beige. She was dressed in a slate-grey Armani suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. Flanking her were 2 cold-eyed men in navy suits, the proxy representatives for Kensington Holdings. The rest of the board, 7 men and women who had spent the last 3 years kissing the ground Vian walked on, sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. "Take a seat, Vian," Odetta said. It was not an invitation. Vian walked to the opposite end of the table and sank into a chair. Minna slipped into a seat along the back wall, her eyes darting frantically between Vian and the woman she had privately mocked as a pathetic, frumpy housewife. "Let us bring this emergency meeting to order," Odetta began, her voice projecting effortlessly across the vast room. She opened a thick leather binder. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, K Holdings has formally exercised its rights under Section 4, Paragraph B of the Series C Mezzanine Debt Covenant. A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Arthur Pendleton, an older board member from a prominent Boston venture capital firm, leaned forward, his face pale. "Mrs. Jasson, Odetta, surely this is a misunderstanding. Exercising that clause means K Holdings is calling in the entire $150 million loan immediately. Aegis doesn't have the liquidity for that. It would bankrupt the company by Tuesday." "I am well aware of Aegis's liquidity, Arthur," Odetta replied smoothly, "which is why K Holdings is executing the alternative provision. We are converting the debt into equity at the pre-negotiated penalty valuation, effectively seizing Mr. Jasson's remaining 60% stake as collateral against the default." "Default?" Vian practically screamed, leaping to his feet. "There is no default. We hit our Q3 projections. We just signed the Maersk shipping contract. You have no legal grounds to call a default." Odetta didn't flinch. She simply turned a page in her binder. "Samuel, please distribute the findings from the forensic audit." Whitman gestured to one of the Kirkland and Ellis associates, who began sliding thick, spiral-bound dossiers to every board member. "Over the past 36 months," Odetta read, her tone clinically detached, "the CEO of Aegis Logistics, Vian Jasson, has engaged in a systematic misappropriation of company funds. While claiming to reinvest capital into our proprietary routing algorithms, Mr. Jasson has been artificially inflating vendor invoices through a shell logistics consultant group based in Delaware. Those funds were subsequently routed to private accounts at Maples Group in the Cayman Islands." The silence in the room was absolute, deafening. Even the hum of the HVAC system seemed to vanish. "That is a lie!" Vian roared, slamming his fists onto the walnut table. He looked wildly at the board members, who were already flipping through the dossiers, their expressions transforming from shock to deep, self-preserving horror. "She's my ex-wife. She's bitter. This is a fabricated smear campaign to steal my company." Odetta looked at him with an expression of profound pity. "Vian, K Holdings didn't just buy your debt. We bought the Delaware consulting firm you thought was so cleverly disguised. We have the wire transfer receipts, the IP logs from your laptop authorizing the transfers, and sworn affidavits from the Cayman account managers who suddenly decided cooperation with the Kensington Trust was vastly preferable to federal prison." Minna, sitting against the back wall, let out a tiny, stifled gasp. She stared at Vian, her meticulously contoured face drained of all color. "The covenant stipulates," Odetta continued, ignoring the interruption, "that any executive action constituting financial fraud or gross negligence triggers an immediate default of the debt, regardless of quarterly performance. As of this moment, K Holdings owns 90% of Aegis Logistics." Arthur Pendleton closed his dossier, taking off his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He didn't look at Vian. "What is the proposal from K Holdings, Miss Kensington?" Hearing the name Kensington spoken aloud in the boardroom hit Vian like a physical blow. "The proposal is simple," Odetta said, closing her binder. "Vian Jasson is terminated as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, for cause. He forfeits all severance packages, unvested stock options, and executive privileges. Furthermore, Aegis Logistics will be filing a formal civil suit against Mr. Jasson by close of business today to recover the misappropriated funds." "You can't do this," Vian whispered, his voice finally breaking. He slumped back into his chair, the adrenaline abandoning him, leaving only terror. "You signed a waiver. You promised me $2 million and a clean break." Odetta stood up. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. I promised to leave your personal bank accounts alone, Vian. The ones we discussed during mediation. Odetta corrected him gently. But the millions you stole from my company, that belongs to Aegis, and I am going to reclaim every single cent. She looked toward the back of the room. Security is waiting in your office, Vian. They will supervise you as you pack your personal effects. You have 15 minutes. The descent from a titan of industry to a corporate pariah took exactly 47 minutes. Vian stood on the sidewalk outside the glass skyscraper, holding a small cardboard box containing a framed photo of his matte black Porsche, a personalized Mont Blanc pen, and a crystal paperweight. The crisp Boston wind whipped around him, but he felt entirely numb. His corporate access card had been deactivated before he even reached the elevator. He pulled out his phone, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He had to call Finch. He had to find a loophole. He dialed the attorney's direct line. It rang 4 times before going to a sterile voicemail. Vian cursed, dialing again. Finally, the receptionist answered, her voice clipped and professional. Gregory Finch's office. Put Finch on the line, Vian barked, trying to muster his usual authority. It's Vian Jasson. There was a long pause. Mr. Jasson, Mr. Finch has instructed me to inform you that our firm is officially withdrawing as your legal counsel. A formal letter of disengagement has been couriered to your residence. What? He can't do that. I have a retainer. Your retainer was paid from an account that has just been frozen by a federal injunction, pending a civil fraud investigation brought by Aegis Logistics. The receptionist stated coldly, We cannot represent you. Please do not call this number again. The line went dead. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Vian's shock. The Cayman accounts. He frantically opened his secure banking app, staring at the screen. The biometric login failed. He typed his password. Access denied. Account suspended. Legal hold. Odetta hadn't just taken his company. She had anticipated his every move, locking the vault from the inside before he even knew he was trapped. He was completely liquid poor. All he had left was the $2 million settlement from the divorce, which, ironically, was sitting in a standard escrow account waiting to be cleared. But with a massive corporate fraud lawsuit hanging over his head, that money would likely be seized by the courts within days. He needed to get back to the apartment. He needed to talk to Minna. They could figure this out. She was brilliant with PR. She could spin this, help him navigate the fallout, maybe launch a new venture. He hailed a cab. His corporate Uber Black account was already disabled, and rode in silence to the luxury high-rise in Back Bay. When he unlocked the door to the $15,000 a month rental, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The second thing he noticed was the absence of the 3 matching Goyard trunks that had occupied the corner of the master bedroom since Minna moved in. "Minna?" he called out, his voice cracking. He walked into the sprawling, minimalist living room. Minna was standing by the marble kitchen island, wearing a sleek trench coat and oversized Celine sunglasses, even though she was indoors. Beside her was a sleek black carry-on bag. "Minna, thank God," Vian exhaled, dropping his cardboard box on the glass coffee table. "It's a nightmare. Odetta. She's insane. She's orchestrated this entire Kensington thing. They've frozen my accounts, but we can fight this. I know people. I still have leverage." Minna didn't move toward him. She remained perfectly still, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. "I saw the audit, Vian," she said. Her voice was completely devoid of the breathless adoration she used to shower on him. It was flat, transactional. "It's a fabrication. Creative accounting, that's all. Every CEO does it to protect their assets from their wives," Minna interrupted, lowering her sunglasses just enough to fix him with a withering glare. "You stole from the company, Vian. You leveraged the firm's future to hide money in the Caymans, and you were too stupid to realize your wife owned the bank." "I was protecting my wealth, our future," Vian pleaded, stepping toward her. Mina held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No, Vian. You were protecting your future, and you lost it. All of it." She picked up her purse, a limited edition Hermes Kelly bag that Vian had bought her for her birthday just 3 weeks ago. "I've spent the last hour on the phone with my headhunters. My reputation is tied to Aegis. Being associated with a disgraced ousted CEO who is about to be indicted for corporate fraud is not a good look for a PR executive." Vian stared at her, the betrayal compounding the horror of the morning. "You're leaving me? Now? When I need you?" "I'm a realist, Vian," Mina said, her tone devoid of malice, which somehow made it worse. It was just business. "I fell in love with a visionary, a billionaire, not a middle-aged man facing federal indictments who doesn't even have a lawyer. The lease on this apartment is in your name. I suggest you call the landlord. Rent is due on the 1st. She walked past him, her expensive perfume lingering in the air. "Goodbye, Vian." The heavy oak door clicked shut. Vian stood alone in the center of the massive, empty apartment. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Boston skyline. Somewhere out there, Odetta was sitting in a garden, holding the reins to an empire, while he had methodically, arrogantly, and completely destroyed his own life. He walked over to his cardboard box, reached inside, and pulled out the Mont Blanc pen. The same pen he had used to sign the divorce papers, convinced he was the smartest man in the room. He stared at the gold nib for a long time before his legs gave out, and he sank to the expensive hardwood floor, burying his face in his hands. The unraveling of Vian Jasson was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing suffocation by 1,000 legal cuts. In the weeks following the boardroom massacre, Vian discovered that the justice system, much like the corporate world, moved with terrifying efficiency when fueled by unlimited capital. Odetta had not simply filed a civil suit, she had unleashed the hounds. She retained Alvarez and Marsal, the premier global forensic accounting firm, to dissect every ledger, expense report, and offshore wire transfer Vian had executed over the past 5 years. They didn't just find the Cayman accounts, they found a labyrinth of shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevis, all tying back to Vian's personal encrypted servers. By Thanksgiving, the Department of Justice handed a silver platter dossier of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement by Odetta's legal team, officially indicted Vian. The SEC immediately froze his domestic assets. The $2 million divorce settlement he had so smugly accepted was seized under civil asset forfeiture, classified as the fruit of commingled, illicit funds. Vian was evicted from the $15,000 a month Back Bay penthouse 2 days before Christmas. He watched, shivering in a cheap peacoat, as a repo truck hooked up his matte black Porsche 911. He was forced to move into a cramped, aggressively beige one-bedroom apartment in a rundown section of Dorchester, putting the first and last month's rent on a high-interest credit card, the only one that hadn't been cancelled. Meanwhile, Odetta's ascent was quietly spectacular. She didn't seek the spotlight. She owned the spotlight and chose to keep it dimmed. She rebranded Aegis Logistics to Kensington Supply Solutions. She didn't install herself as the permanent CEO. She knew where her expertise lay and where it didn't. Instead, she poached a brilliant, fiercely ethical logistics executive from Maersk to run the day-to-day operations, while she assumed the role of chairwoman of the board. Under her guidance, the toxic, hyper-aggressive bro culture Vianney had cultivated was systematically dismantled. The The company stabilized, paid down the toxic debts Vian had accrued, and within 8 months secured a landmark federal contract with the Department of Defense. Vian, conversely, spent his days in a cheap, mismatched suit, taking the MBTA Red Line into the city to meet with a string of increasingly exhausted public defenders. He couldn't afford a white-collar defense boutique. He was represented by a perpetually sweating, overworked attorney named Miller, whose office smelled faintly of stale coffee and defeat. "You don't have leverage, Vian," Miller sighed one bleak afternoon in February, tossing a massive stack of DOJ discovery documents onto his cluttered desk. "They have IP logs. They have cooperating witnesses from Maple's group. Hell, they even have an email you sent to Minna Jenkins detailing the Delaware tax loophole you were exploiting. It's over. The AUSA is offering a plea deal. 5 years in federal lockup. If we take this to trial, you are looking at 20 mandatory minimum." Vian stared at the dirty linoleum floor. He looked entirely hollowed out. He had lost 20 pounds. The silver at his temples, once a mark of distinguished executive stress, had turned into a dull, unkempt grey. 5 years, he whispered. "I'm 42. My life is over." "Your life as a billionaire CEO is over," Miller corrected him, without an ounce of sympathy. "Take the deal, Vian. Odetta Kensington's lawyers have built a titanium cage around you. If you fight her, she will bury you under the jail." Vian thought of Odetta. He thought of the beige sweaters, the quiet weekends at the botanical gardens, the way he had dismissed her as a simpleton. He had built his entire identity on being the smartest man in the room, completely blind to the fact that he was merely a pawn on a chessboard owned by his wife. "Okay," Vian choked out, the last ounce of his pride shattering into dust. "I'll take the plea." The sentencing took place on a brutally cold, rain-swept Tuesday in late April at the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse in Boston. Outside the sweeping glass facade, a modest swarm of local press and financial bloggers had gathered, their camera flashes cutting through the dreary morning fog. A year ago, Vian Jasson would have orchestrated this media presence, stepping out of a chauffeur-driven town car to announce a new acquisition. Today, he arrived in the back of a damp city cab, his collar turned up against the wind, trying vainly to shield his face with a damp copy of the Wall Street Journal. The interior of Courtroom 11 was vast, panelled in dark, imposing mahogany, and smelling sharply of lemon polish and institutional dread. Vian stood at the defense table, feeling the rough, synthetic fabric of his off-the-rack grey suit chafing against his skin. He had lost 25 pounds since the day he signed the divorce papers. The silver at his temples, once carefully styled to project distinguished executive wisdom, had spread into a dull, unkempt grey, thinned by chronic stress and insomnia. Beside him stood his court-appointed attorney, Miller, a man who perpetually smelled of stale coffee and whose entire defense strategy consisted of begging for leniency. Across the aisle, Assistant United States Attorney Robert Calloway was organizing his files with the precise, lethal efficiency of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. Calloway had spent the last 2 hours meticulously dismantling whatever shred of dignity Vian had left, projecting emails, offshore bank routing numbers, and encrypted text messages onto a massive screen for the jury and the judge to see. "Your Honor," Calloway said, his voice ringing through the cavernous room. The defendant did not simply make an error in judgment. He constructed an elaborate, predatory ecosystem of fraud. He weaponized his own company's growth to line his pockets, utilizing shell corporations in Nevis and Delaware to siphon off $18.5 million. He did this while simultaneously attempting to defraud his then-wife of her rightful marital assets, completely unaware that his victim was, in fact, the very financial institution keeping his house of cards upright. This is a case of pathological hubris. Vian stared at the heavy oak table, his hands trembling. He had pled guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of corporate embezzlement, hoping the admission would buy him a shred of mercy. He looked up at Judge Helen Croft, an imposing woman known in the Massachusetts district for her absolute lack of tolerance for white-collar grifters. "Mr. Jason," Judge Croft began, peering over her reading glasses, her voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You stood at the helm of a highly successful enterprise. You possessed wealth, status, and privilege that 99% of the population can only dream of. Yet, it was not enough. Your greed was a bottomless well. You treated your employees, your investors, and your own spouse as collateral damage in your pursuit of a fabricated, untouchable kingdom." She paused, adjusting the heavy stack of sentencing guidelines. "It is the judgment of this court that the defendant, Vian Jason, be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons to be imprisoned for a term of 60 months. This will be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay full restitution in the amount of $18,500,000. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company." The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded to Vian like a gunshot. 60 months. 5 years. In a federal penitentiary. The defendant is a flight risk, given his demonstrated history of moving assets offshore, Calloway interjected smoothly. "The state requests immediate remand into custody." "Granted," Judge Croft said without hesitation. "Bail is revoked." 2 heavy-set federal marshals immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the gallery, their faces impassive. As the reality of immediate incarceration hit him, Vian's knees buckled slightly. He turned around, his chest heaving in a panic attack he could no longer suppress, desperately looking out into the gallery for a familiar face, a sympathetic eye, anything to ground him. Sitting in the very back row, entirely alone, was Odetta. She wasn't wearing an Armani power suit today. She was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored navy blue wool coat, the exact same coat she had worn to the mediation, where Vian had so gleefully stolen what he thought was her future. Her posture was impeccable. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on him, as unreadable and deep as the Atlantic. As the marshals approached Vian, unclipping heavy steel handcuffs from their belts, Odetta stood up. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply walked down the center aisle, her low heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. Vian held up a shaking hand toward the marshals. "Please, just 10 seconds. She's my wife, my ex-wife." The lead marshal paused, keeping a firm, bruising grip on Vian's bicep. Odetta stopped just on the other side of the low wooden partition separating the gallery from the well of the court. The silence between them was heavier than the judge's 5-year sentence. "Did you come to watch me get dragged away in chains?" Vian choked out, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of the arrogant armor that had defined his entire adult existence. "Are you finally satisfied, Odetta?" Odetta looked at him, her expression softening into something that looked dangerously, excruciatingly like pity. That profound pity hurt Vian more than the cold steel currently being ratcheted around his wrists. "I didn't do this to find satisfaction, Vian," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the courtroom's ventilation system. "I did this because you left me no other choice. I spent 10 years watching you measure human worth by zip codes, luxury cars, and the balances of offshore accounts. You thought my silence was weakness. You thought my thriftiness was stupidity. You assumed that because I didn't scream for power, I didn't possess any. I underestimated you, Vian whispered, a single humiliating tear cutting a track down his pale cheek. You took everything. I have nothing left. I didn't take anything, Odetta corrected him, her tone perfectly level, devoid of malice but hardened by absolute truth. You threw it away. You had a wife who loved you when you were a broke engineering student eating ramen. You had a brilliant company that was legally half yours. You had a beautiful, secure life, but it wasn't enough. You wanted to be a god. She adjusted the strap of her modest, unbranded leather handbag. I am the sole managing heir to the Kensington Trust, Vian. I could have bought you 100 logistics companies. I could have given you the world. All you had to do was be a decent man. She turned away, preparing to walk back up the aisle. Odetta! Vian called out, a desperate, pathetic plea echoing in the cavernous room as the marshal forced his arms behind his back, the handcuffs clicking shut with finality. What about Minna? Does she know? Did you ruin her too? Odetta paused, looking back over her shoulder. The ambient light from the high windows caught the subtle elegance of her profile. Minna Jenkins negotiated an immunity deal with the Department of Justice 3 months ago in exchange for handing over your encrypted hard drives, Odetta said simply. She is currently the director of communications for a rival tech firm in Silicon Valley. As I recall, she told the prosecution that you were, and I quote, a stepping stone who lost his footing. Vian gasped as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His breathing grew shallow and ragged. The ultimate twist of the knife hadn't even come from his billionaire ex-wife, but from the woman he had destroyed his marriage to impress. You serve your time, Vian, Odetta said quietly, her eyes lingering on his handcuffed wrists for a fraction of a second. And when you finally get out, I suggest you learn how to find joy in a quiet, mediocre life, because it is the only one you will ever have left. She turned and walked through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. They swung shut behind her, with a heavy, muffled thud, leaving Vian standing in the echoing silence of his own complete ruin, waiting to be led away into the dark. The tragedy of Vian Jasson was not born of sudden misfortune, but of profound, blinding arrogance. He mistook kindness for ignorance and quiet contentment for a lack of ambition, ultimately signing away his own empire in a desperate bid to protect his ego. Odetta's ultimate victory wasn't achieved through screaming matches or vindictive rage, but through the terrifying patience of a woman who knew her true worth. She allowed Vian's greed to become the very architect of his destruction, proving that the most lethal power is the kind that never feels the need to announce itself. In the end, the story serves as a chilling testament to hubris. A man who believed he was pulling off the perfect heist, only to realize he had been handing over the keys to his own prison, outplayed by the very person he thought he had left behind.